Welcome, everybody. Good to see those of you who I can see, and lovely to have everybody else here who is here. So the goal of what I want for us to do over the course of the next hour or so is to help you all think through strategies for effecting change in those policy areas that you care most about, recognizing that we've got an hour, so we're not going to be able to put together a super sophisticated and comprehensive plan, but I am hoping that by the end of it, you've got a little bit better sense as to the spaces in the political structure where you can intervene and make progress in the ways that you care about, right? So I want to start us off by asking each of you now just to think for yourselves about, and I've got issues in the plural here, but because we've got so many people logged on, I'm going to ask you to think about what is the one issue that you care most about, that you are most passionate about. And I am going to stop sharing that slide, and I am going to put out a whiteboard, and Maddie, I think, is going to help you figure out how to use the whiteboard. And once she does, I would like you to simply write down the issue that is the one that you care most about or that you're most passionate about. And when you're ready, just start filling up the board. It's going to get messy, but that's okay. All right, immigration policy, someone says. Racial justice, ending violence against women, racial equality, sustainable development. Up, here we go. Access to education. Let me see if I can't. Homelessness. Just move some things around so we can see nutrition. Another homelessness. Recovery, and it looks like something caught off, but I'm going to say that probably is substance misuse disorders. Affordable housing, workforce housing. Environmental justice, protecting public lands, variation on immigration policy, specifically about asylum seekers, just sort of a broad category of justice, transportation for low-income individuals, SUD, substance misuse disorders and mobile recovery, elder rights, homelessness. Again, I'm just going to try to group that. Whoops, I've screwed something up horribly. No one will ever know, except that everyone will know. Homelessness, mental health and wellness. And if for any reason you're having trouble getting something onto the whiteboard, you can also put it into the chat. All right, take just another couple of seconds. Let me see if I can't. Hospice awareness, more sort of racial equity, racial equality. It's a larger conversation for another day, but I would love for us to talk about distinguishing between equality and equity, but that's a whole separate thing. We'll do that another time. Sustainable development. Restoring democratic government, taxes in New Hampshire, access to food. Okay, so keep going. For those of you who haven't put, I'm just trying to sort of move things around so we've got a little bit more space. But now what I would like you to do is, starting with your issue, is you think about, all right, if I wanted to affect change in this area, right? Is this a national issue, a federal issue, or a national issue? And I will use those two words interchangeably. Is it a state level issue, or is it a local issue, right? So is it N for national, S for state, or L for local? So now if you would use the drawing tool instead, so that's in the same little box and it says draw with a squiggly line, and choose the smallest squiggle. And just, there we go, right? And next to your policy, write an N, an S, or an L. And this is going to get even more messy. We got a lot of N's. We've got an A. It's hard to do that, isn't it? An S, right? Taxes in New Hampshire is largely an S. Good, we've got for environmental justice N, S, and L, right? That's an issue that probably crosses all three of those levels of government. Mental health and wellness, national and state. Transportation for low-income individuals, state and local. Elder rights, national, state, and local. Justice, national, state, and local. What's missing? What about hospice? We've got the heart emoji, which it means it's all encompassing and crosses all of those areas. All right, take another second or two. And if there's anything that you see, whether it's your issue or not, that doesn't have a level of government attached to it. So over there with all of the home, we've got homelessness, ending homelessness with affordable housing, homelessness, good. Yeah, I don't see a lot of state, national, local. I think I would be inclined to agree. Human rights, you know, that could mean any number of different things, but national, state, and local. All right, just another couple of seconds. And before we go away, whoops, wrong button. I'm gonna do this, and any of you, I believe, can do this too. In your little toolbar, there's a little save icon, an arrow that moves down. If for any reason you wanna save this, and I saved a copy of it in case we want to return to it later. But meanwhile, I'm going to move away from this screen. And I am going to bring us back to, there we go, to my slides, right? And, you know, the first point that I want to make as we think about how do I begin to think about how to make change in the area that I care about? One useful place to start, right, is figuring out, well, okay, what is the issue, right? And if we had more time, we would probably take each of those categories of issues that you put up there, and I'd probably make you get much more specific about it, right? So you say affordable housing, well, what does that mean? Right, and are we talking about creating public housing? Are we talking about public-private partnerships that create local development projects? Right, how do we sort of mean by that? But the first thing you need to do is figure out where in government do I need to be directing my attention, which means figuring out which level of government has most responsibility for the issue that I care about. And as you all saw, a number of those issues, right, they cross boundaries, right? And that's because one of the themes that I am going to hammer home this afternoon is that in the United States, we have one of the most complicated political and policy-making systems of any democracy in the world. And I mean that literally. I don't mean that to be hyperbolic. We've got an extraordinarily complicated system, and one that's very complicated compared to others. So part of our challenge is figuring out where are those spaces in the system that have control over the things that we care about, and how do we intervene productively, right? So the American political system divides power in any number of ways. One of the ways it does it is by level of government, right? This is what we call federalism. Maybe this is familiar from either college or a high school civics course, right? National, state, and local. And there are some issues that tend to be overwhelmingly state and local, right? That's that sort of the piece of the Venn diagram on the right. There are issues that are largely, if not exclusively, national issues, right? Declaring war, right? New Hampshire doesn't declare war on Spain, I hope, unless I've missed something in the news today. That would be a function of the national government. And there's lots of stuff that winds up sitting in this odd space in between, right? That has partial federal control and partial state control. One of the first things that I would encourage you to think about doing is try to pinpoint where particularly is the power to alter the issues or the policies that you care about, right? Just to underline the complexity issue, this is, if you look toward the bottom, that's the 2012 total number. But if you look at, these are census data breaking it out for up to 2007. If you look at that column on the right for 2007, right? Counting state, federal, local, county governments in the United States, right? 90,000 separate public entities that have some autonomous power for policymaking, right? You wonder, right? Why does it seem that it's so hard for people to get anything done? That's one of the reasons, right? Is that we don't have this big, large, centralized national government that is able to control large swaths of policy across the entire nation. We've got this power that is divided and divided again, and then often divided again across levels of government, right? So appreciating that and thinking that through will help you be strategic about how you direct your energies, right? If the thing that you are most concerned about is a narrow practice that happens in your local elementary school, right? It may be that writing to your United States Senator about this issue is wasted effort, right? That's not where the decision is being made. So thinking that through, doing a little research and understanding that for yourself can turn out to be helpful. Now, of course, as you also, I hope, remember from either high school civics or even better, maybe a college level course in government, that's not the only way in which the American political system divides power, right? We divide it by level of government, federal, state, local, but also divide it by function. Right, so we've got Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch. That's the lawmaking apparatus, right? That's the United States Congress. But even that is divided into two separate pieces, of course, the House and the Senate. That's the lawmaking body. You've got the executive branch, right, which is responsible for carrying out those laws, executing those laws and policies, and the judicial branch, which is responsible for overseeing both the lawmaking process and the implementing process, right? So you've got, again, power doesn't reside in this single place. It's divided across these multiple institutions. This, of course, is common, that happens at the state level and at the local level too, right? But it's not just that we've got these powers separated across branches, of course. It's that each of those branches often has a role in the operation of the other, right? This you'll remember as checks and balances, right? So while we have got separate institutions which have separate powers, none of them, by and large, has all of the power. And that we've got a political system that by its very structure requires cooperation among those branches in order to get anything done. Right? That's unusual. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that, right? Because those aren't the only things that wind up having influence in which laws get made, which laws don't get made, which laws get paid attention to, right? We've got all sorts of laws that we kind of ignore, others that we prioritize. You've got political parties, right, which have their own particular sphere of influence and are important actors in almost any act of policymaking. You've got interest groups, right? You've got external groups of people that pool their resources and try to push the system into doing one thing rather than another. Some of those are enormously influential, some of them are weak, but understanding that is an important part of understanding what the likelihood of getting done what you want to get done is. We've got, apart just from interest, we've got private corporate actors, right? We've got a number of people talked about environmental issues. We've got very large, very wealthy oil and gas industries who devote enormous amounts of time and money and resources into influencing the political process. If that's an area you're working on, you got to think about that and think about that seriously, right? What does that mean? What spaces still remain for me to intrude? We've got not-for-profit organizations, right, that are fighting often different kinds of fights. So those folks who pointed to homelessness as an issue, right, there are coalitions of organizations across the country that work by and for people experiencing homelessness. What are they doing, right? We've got think tanks. These are sort of semi-autonomous organizations, some of them in Washington, some of them in other places, that put together plans and strategies and ideas and try to put those in front of lawmakers and get them to pay attention to their idea. We, of course, have sort of the whole broad sphere of media actors, right, which are trying to get people to pay attention to one issue rather than another, that are supporting one thing, that are opposing another thing. There's the sort of the larger corporate media interests, and then of course there's this growing sphere of social media, right, which in smaller actors and smaller groups can push attention in one direction or another. And then we've got public opinion, which in its own way can be its own separate force, right, either by convincing large numbers of people that your position is the right one and getting them to start acting on your behalf, or using public opinion as an actual argument, right? I've got a series of polls here that show that X% of the American public believes X, and that can sometimes become its own force, right? That complexity, and you're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but I think it's the thing that is most important about thinking about affecting change in the United States, and the thing that I think we don't appreciate enough. This is sort of complicated, but it's looking at just basic structures of national political systems in largely large post-industrial democracies around the world, right? And it's looking at the number of places in each of those systems for somebody, some group of people to stop it from acting, right? And that's a veto player, right? A veto is someone who can stop something from happening, right? So if you look at the top, right, Finland, Greece, Luxembourg, Portugal, New England, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway, they've got political systems that basically only have one veto point. Right? It's only one real opportunity to stop something from happening if the party in control is trying to make something happen. Go all the way down to the bottom, right? 4 veto players. Notice there is only a single country in that list. That is the United States of America, right? As a matter of the literal structure of our Constitution, there are more opportunities to hinder change, to slow change, to stop it from happening entirely than there are in those other countries, right? And this is by design, by and large, right? And that's, again, a larger conversation for another time. But if you read the Federalist Papers, right, the writings of the men, the largely white, property slave owning men who wrote the Constitution, they were explicit about wanting to make sure that no single individual or group or even majority would be able to too easily get control of the system or enact change, right? It's a system that was intentionally designed to frustrate the ability of even a determined majority to exert its will. It's complicated, is my point. All right. So we're gonna turn now to what do we do about that, given that complexity, right? We're not gonna throw up our hands and say, all right, well, it's too hard, I'm gonna go and do something else. But before I do that, Maddie, do you have questions just sort of about the basic structure stuff before I talk about some ways to think about how to affect change nonetheless?
I don't
Oh, and that's
see
Larissa
any.
actually who's doing questions.
Yeah, I was gonna just ask
Nope,
Larissa,
that's
have you
okay.
had any?
So no questions about the structure so far, but definitely folks are
Okay.
getting interested about how to effectively shake
Okay.
tiny fists against the mountain.
Okay. So let's start talking about some of that. And I will try to tool through this pretty quickly, and that way we'll leave lots of time for Q&A. Right, so I think the first thing that is useful for each of you to do, regardless of your policy area, is develop expertise. You got to know what you're talking about, right? The deeper and more sophisticated your substantive knowledge of the issue, and the deeper and more sophisticated your knowledge about who the key political players are, right? The more chance you're going to have at success, and the greater the chance that people are going to take you seriously, right? If you really know your stuff, if you decide that you're going to, when we get to a world in which such a thing is possible, meet in person with your United States House of Representatives member because you want to talk about your issue, right? If you are able to surprise that member by the sophistication of your knowledge, right? And they can say, well, you know, I sponsored a bill, and you're able to say, yes, I know it's HR 42, but I'm particularly interested in Section 3. They're going to listen to you differently. And that exchange is going to play out differently, and they are going to respond differently to you because you will have demonstrated that you've done the work and that you care about this issue in more than a superficial kind of way. In that vein, know who represents you, right? Know who represents you and make sure that you're thinking about when you're reaching out to elected officials who have power over the issue, that again, you're reaching out at the right level. There are lots and lots and lots of ways to do this. Govtrack.us is a super simple portal. Literally go in and plug in your street address where you live, right, where your legal residence is, right? And that will pop up a list of your state representatives. I think this one does just federal, so it will give you your US House member or members and your 2 US senators. If you go to Ballotopedia, it will, I think, give you also state representatives, state level representatives, and city level representatives, right? This will also, as the other one will, right, let you search issues, current bills, things that are currently moving through the legislature. You can, in many of these, go in and sign yourself up for alerts. So do a search, and maybe there's a bill that is really relevant to you or to your neighborhood or to the people you work with or for. You can often set up alerts, so it'll send you an email when that bill is moving its way through the process. And here's a way, a New Hampshire specific way, to identify your representatives for the state of New Hampshire, right? And that would be your state senator or your state reps, keeping in mind that we've got lots of those, right? The New Hampshire State House, House of Representatives is the 4th largest representative body on the planet, right? After British Parliament, Indian Parliament, and the United States Congress. The fourth on that list is the New Hampshire House of Representatives, right? What that means is that they're pretty easy to get to, right? They're accessible, and that's hugely, powerfully advantageous if you live in New Hampshire. All right, so you've developed some knowledge about the issue. You know who it is who represents you or who sits on the relevant committees that deals with that issue, right? Don't be afraid to use your phone. I know some of you will have no idea what it is you're looking at. That's an old timey phone. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call, right? As a general rule, if you are trying to influence policy and communicate to elected officials, the more work it takes to do what you're doing, the more seriously you'll be taken, right? So if there's a petition that someone is circulating about an issue you care for, absolutely sign that if you want, right? That's probably lowest level of impact, right? Because how easy is that? Picking up a phone is harder, right? Pick up the phone, you can find the number at those databases, call the office and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a constituent. And you want to make sure you tell people that because they don't care what you think if they don't represent you as a rule. So almost always, and there are exceptions, but almost always you want to be reaching out to the people who represent you, and they represent you. So you should never, ever, 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 ever feel shy about reaching out. You always want to be professional. You always want to know what you're talking about, right? You always want to engage in a conversation with that staff person, right? Because you're likely to get a staff person rather than the actual member that communicates to them that you care about the issues and that you are going to be keeping track of what they are doing or not doing, right? Write them, right? Again, you will periodically see like form letters that get circulated and you just change it and so your name. Folks, legislators are pretty sophisticated about that now. They will see, or their staff members are, right? They will see it's like, oh, okay, this is a form letter. They're not going to take that too terribly seriously, right? But if there is a form letter and you do care about the issue, write your own version, right? It will make a difference. Again, the more effort that you demonstrate you have put into communicating to elected officials, the more likely they are to pay attention to what it is that you are saying, right? Email is the most practical way. I used to, particularly at the national level, encourage people to write or type an actual physical letter and put a stamp on it and send it in the mail, because both clamped down on security after the attacks of September 11th and now the global coronavirus pandemic. Mail has a harder time reaching elected officials, so your best bet is probably email under these circumstances. But take your time, make it professional, have it proofread, format it properly, right? Always address, even if it's someone whose position makes you so angry you could spit, you always want to be the grown-up in the room. Always. You always want to be professional. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be honest and forthright. And if you think they are engaging in policy that is causing harm to people, tell them that and then show them, right? Walk through it. Don't ever just hurl invective, although sometimes I get it, that feels good. That is not a productive way to build relationships with people in power who you want to do something for you, right? Think about it as relationship building. This is another one of those places where, again, in ordinary times, there's a huge advantage to living in New Hampshire because there are extraordinary opportunities to testify in front of committees in the Senate or the House that are considering legislation. You go to the website of the New Hampshire General Court, right? That's the name for our legislature. All public hearings are listed there. And again, ordinarily, You can show up for any one of those hearings. You sign a little list at the front of the room and say, I would like to speak. And you wait your turn and they call you up, and you've typically got 3 to 5 minutes, and you can say anything that you want to that committee. It's an extraordinary opportunity again. And if you've developed expertise, right, you really may know things that those legislators do not know. And it is absolutely a thing, particularly at the state and the city level. People's minds get changed because they learn new information from people who come to testify. So again, when we get back into a world in which this is ordinary course of business, think about this if you've got a state or a city issue. This is sort of the easy, obvious stuff, although sometimes less and less easy, right? Vote, but vote in every election that is taking place. And that means not just the big presidential election happening in November. It means every primary election happening in between. It means every local election. If you've got county sheriffs being elected, take a few minutes, learn something about the candidates for sheriff, right? And make a point that you will show up every time to vote. Now, this is one of those instances where is your vote likely to make a difference? Probably not, although again, in New Hampshire, in some very small districts and some local elections, they're sometimes won by a tiny handful of votes, right? But you and all of the people who you work with and communicate with about your issues, right? All of you together consistently showing up and knowing what's being voted on and what the impact is, that can have real powerful effect, right? And sitting, of course, in between testifying and voting is town meeting in New Hampshire, right? Another extraordinary opportunity to be keyed into what's going on locally, but to also weigh in and have your voice heard. Contribute, right? And it doesn't have to be a lot of money, but if you are able to send $5 to a candidate or $2 to a candidate, right? And you are able to pick up the phone and say, hi, I'm Stephen Pimpare. I am a constituent and a contributor to Representative so-and-so, and I wonder if I could share some thoughts I have about the bill about issue X that is currently being considered, right? It's a marginal impact because none of us is likely to be, right, bundling hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of contributions. But again, that's another signal, right? It's a way to say, I care enough about this that I am willing to put my money where my mouth is, right? You don't have to tell them, I mean, they can look up, right? This is all public information, what you contribute. The other advantage of this is, and this could be a disadvantage depending on how you look at it, is that being a contributor automatically gets you on a mailing list, right? But then you will get regular updates from your elected official telling you what it is that they are doing, right? So again, it's an easy way to become keyed in. Protest, right? Show up in large numbers and make noise, right? I think that we have, over the course of the last, 6 or 8 weeks, been reminded of the enormous power of civic action, of collective disruptive protest, right? I think this is one of the key factors of the American political system, is that you've got to have what organizers will sometimes call an inside-outside strategy, right? Meaning you have to work from the inside. You have to know what the legislature is doing or what the executive branch is doing, and you have to know who's sitting on what committee and who's doing what, right? But you also need to recognize that those legislatures are slow and clunky and hidebound, and often need external pressure to force them to pay attention to something they're not paying attention to, or to do something that they do not want to do, right? I would argue that every large-scale advance of political rights, economic rights, social rights in all of US history has at its heart collective disruptive movement activity, right? It's not the only thing that matters, but it is, I think, a necessary condition. And as we work our way toward the end of the categories here, organize, right? It is, you are always more effective in a group than you are on your own. It is also easier if you are working in a group, right? Because you can share responsibility. You can share responsibility for gathering information or knowledge. You can put a group of people together and say, okay, we're going to track what New Hampshire is doing on issue X. You follow this committee, you follow this committee, you follow this committee, right? Or if there's something that's going on in your neighborhood, right? And you're feeling like you can't get anyone to listen to you, talk to your neighbors, right? Let them know, right? Some of them probably don't know, right? Because people are busy and tend not to pay attention to politics for the most part, right? So maybe you can find that they actually would be interested in helping if they are aware of what's going on, right? And again, this is where movements don't emerge out of nowhere. They emerge out of often long, consistent efforts at organization. And then finally, right, if you're finding that work internal to and external to the system is insufficient, maybe you need to be more centrally located in those policy-making systems, right? So run for something. Again, New Hampshire makes this radically easier than it is in lots and lots and lots of places. And in many of the places where you live, they are desperate for people to sit on the budget committee or to sit on the library committee or to sit on the zoning board, right? Those are often literally people begging, and you will run uncontested races. You'll be the only one on the ballot, right? And those are amazing places to start, to get the insider's view of how the system works. And then maybe, so you've been on the zoning board for a couple of years, you feel like you know a little something. Maybe there's a seat that's opening up on the select board or the alder board, whatever they call it in your location, right? Maybe you're going to run for that seat, right? Or maybe, right, there's a good chance to unseat a New Hampshire House rep who has been there for 4,000 years and isn't really doing anything, right? Maybe there's an opportunity there. Think about that. Here's my final thought before we go to questions and open it up. This is all hard, right? This is Max Weber, who is arguably sort of the first professor of public policy. And he wrote this in a long article called Politics as a Vocation. He said that politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards, right? And that's that tool, right? It's like a hand drill, right? Strong pressure applied consistently over long periods of time against systems that are resistant to change. Super unsexy and unfun, right? But by and large, in the US political system, we don't have large-scale radical change happening overnight. It happens incrementally, right? It happens by being persistent and setting small, achievable goals and working on them one by one by one by one by one. And over time, that's often where we get those larger scale changes. All right, and with that, why don't I stop sharing and then sort of see who I can see. Feel free to turn on your camera if you feel like it so I can see folks. No obligation to do that if you don't. And then Larissa, you've been looking through questions, correct?
Yes. So a couple of questions so far, and we invite you folks to continue to share your questions with us. What are you curious about? What do you want to know more about? But to get us started, what are a couple steps that someone can take to develop their expertise about an issue?
That's a great question, and it's back, I am 54 years old, right? So I lived about half of my life in a world without computers in the way that we understand them today, right? And I used to live in a world in which acquiring information was the hard part, right? That is no longer the world we live in, right? The world we live in is that there is this giant fire hose of information that is often constantly pushing stuff at us. And the hard part is figuring out what's useful, what's not useful, what do I trust, what do I not trust, right? So here are, and I will confess that there is no easy answer to this, unfortunately. It is really hard to develop sources of reliable, trustworthy, relevant information, right? Here's what I would suggest. Start narrowly with the issues that you care about, right? So if it is working on affordable housing in order to reduce the number of people who are experiencing homelessness, right? Start by looking locally at the organizations who do that work and get on their mailing lists, right? Have them send you what they're working on. Look at your local elected officials, right? Who are the people who work on housing issues? Who are the people who work on homelessness issues, right? Can you get on their mailing lists, right? And again, have them, so they will then say, well, the city of Manchester, where I live, has been following CDC guidelines and not displacing homeless people who have set up independent camps around the city, but instead have actually provided bathrooms and hand washing stations, right? They are considering now altering that policy and starting to push people back into the inside shelter system, right? Part of how I know that is because some of the people who do that work at the city level have been communicating that to their constituents, right? So I get those updates. I know in Manchester, there's a local news source called Manchester Inc. Link, which is run by a journalist called Carolyn Robideau. And she pulls stuff from the union leader. She pulls stuff from the Concord Monitor. She pulls stuff sometimes from the Seacoast papers. But she also does her own local reporting, and it is super local reporting, right? So she goes to the Alder board meetings, right? She goes when the mayor is holding a press conference and reports on what's going on and what it is that people had to say, right? So that becomes easy. The harder part, particularly when you're looking at national issues, is finding sources more broadly on national politics that you can trust, right? And again, I think there is no super easy way to do that. I think you've got national outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post that on their news pages are generally trying not to lie to you. But, I mean, I start every morning with my first cup of coffee, sort of reading through the national news, and my neighbors can tell you I start the morning yelling, right? Like, wait a minute, why are you leaving out this? And why are you not saying, right? So the problem is you've always got to be sort of active and you've got to be pulling information from multiple sources, right? And this is super frustrating, right? Because it's not like, well, if you go and you read this, you're solid. To the best of my knowledge, no such thing, right? But you can develop reporters who you trust, right? Who you've read enough over time that you say, you know what, they're working really hard to give me useful information so that I can figure out how to think about this. And when they get it wrong, they're right up front about admitting that, right? Which is a huge piece of the equation, right? Is folks who really are trustworthy in that way. Yeah, and it's like, folks recommending, it's like, there's a lot of good reporting that often comes out of the New Yorker. If you've been following sort of epidemiology state by state on coronavirus, The Atlantic has been doing really good, deep, in-depth reporting. But there's other stuff that in The Atlantic that I think is crap, right? So it's, you know, and your mileage will vary on that. Yeah. The other thing is that there are a couple of online outlets that are, they call themselves data journalists, but they're often economists, academic economists, and political scientists who try to make sense of the world from the discipline. So Wonk Blog is one of them. The Upshot, which is published in the New York Times, is one of them. Mischiefs of Faction is political historians who try to make sense of the politics of the day. Vox.com genuinely tries to draw on the academic literature, or will, like The Monkey Cage, which is published in the Washington Post. If there's something going on in Syria, right, they will turn to, you know, sort of professors